Welcome to our last lecture in Ancient Rome, where we'll be discussing the Late Empire. So if we come back to our dates, we discussed the Republic, Early Empire, High Empire, and we ended with a few of our 5 good emperors, which, just the name 5 good emperors really indicates that those who follow are not. So, we ended with Marcus Aurelius, which his reign ended in 180 AD, and then 193, so not too much later, we have Septimus Severus. So here's a coin of Septimus Severus. He was from North Africa, which was a province of Rome at the time, and here is, on the other side of the coin, Julia Domna, their younger son Caracalla. He's wearing that lorette, that signal of victory around the crown of his head, also associated with his royal status because he's next in line. Look how it mimics his father. And then his brother and supposed to be co-heir, Geta. So this is the Severn Tondo. We haven't looked at many examples of paintings, but here's one. This was a more common practice in the northern African provinces of Rome. And so here we have again the same family members. We'll see Septimus Severus, his wife Julia Domna, Caracalla, and brother and co-heir Geta. However, what do we notice? So this is another example of how important portraiture is to the ancient Romans, because here we have just Geta's face that has been removed. This is important with understanding the late empire. So after Septimus's death, in which Caracalla had ruled with his father for a short period of time, the plan was for Caracalla and his brother Geta to rule together. The Roman Empire is massive at this point. It's hard to control under one person. However, this didn't work out. And so there's this extreme rivalry between the two, and they both start to amass troops. We almost go into a civil war, until Caracalla murders his brother Geta. So remember, our origin of Rome with Romulus and Remus. Romulus killed his own brother. So there's this idea of triumph through blood has been embedded within Roman culture. And so he removed the portraits of his brother. We have this other example of damnatio memoriae, which we already discussed. Think back to Cleopatra, the removal of images of them to damn their memory. It should be noted that in Northern Africa, here are some examples of these mummy pictures. So they were paintings. They were paintings that were placed atop the head of the mummies during this time period. They were extremely common in the Roman provinces in Northern Africa. If you go to even our local Menil Museum, they have quite a few of these, so it's neat to see. Again, iconoclasm, damnatio memoriae, the damning of his memory. And so hopefully this is indicative of the blood, or tells you about the bloodshed of the late empire. The late empire is often characterized as the beginning of the fall of Rome. It's marking this period where things start to fall. We've reached our peak, and now things are going downhill. So here's a marble portrait of Caracalla. Again, he murdered his brother to become the sole ruler by 211, and he was later murdered by his successor. And for the next 50 years after him, we have about 20 rulers that are assassinated. So much of this time period is marked by this extreme political unrest, this breakdown in rulership. So let's compare his portrait to Marcus Aurelius, who came not long before him. And we can really see Caracalla's, this is often described as this psychological portrayal. It's extremely expressionistic. It's also extremely lifelike and naturalistic. The details around his eyes really mark him as an individual person. It's not just generic. And we have the details of his beard, his hair, etc. But let's focus on this expression and how this is indicative of this time period. It's much more truthful of how he's portrayed. So compared to Marcus Aurelius, where he is this benevolent ruler, where he's taking care of his people, versus Caracalla, where he looks angry. His eyebrows are furrowed. He's staring someone off into the distance, it seems. And so instead we're not seeing so much the power of the ruler, but instead we're seeing this fear of the ruler. And the ruler himself is fearful. So consider again, he's murdered by his successor. So he's constantly looking over his back. He murdered his own brother, so he knows what people are capable of. And so other people who are vying for power, he's constantly looking over his shoulder for. And so there's this sense of paranoia as well, where he's looking off, he's trying to sense what threat is there. But he's also trying to show his own anger in order to instill fear within his people and those around him. So it's much more expressionistic. And this helps to define this time period. Here's the Ludovisi battle sarcophagus. By this time period, most Romans are burying their dead instead of cremating them. And Rome is really at war for most of this century, as we see here, the likely death of a warrior. The nomenclature is off. This was part of a Cardinal Ludovisi's collection. He acquired it in the 17th century. It was actually found at a tomb near Rome. So no one knows who the sarcophagus belongs to. It's not that we had archaeologists in that time period, but whoever was wealthy for them to be able to afford not only this marble material, which is not as plentiful as it was in Greece when we think back to ancient Greek works, but also just the amount of detail and time that it took to carve this sarcophagus. So the rich carvings suggest a wealthy patron with a military background because of this military scene. And this was created at a time in Roman history which was marked by instability, civil war. So things are extremely chaotic. And we see that within the composition. This composition is extremely chaotic. So it reflects the instability of this time period. So here's a more high definition example. And I want to use this to introduce a new term called horror vacui. And this is where there's pretty much no negative space, where this extremely crowded surface with these figures piled atop one another gives no room for negative space. This composition is extremely congested. And so what we're seeing here is this battle. The Roman army are conquering these bearded barbarian Goths, another group of people. Again, reflecting the chaos of war. And this is extremely high relief, as you can see by the multiple layers. We have figures who are closer to the viewer. We seem to have figures behind them and behind them, etc. This extremely chaotic composition where your eye is drawn across the whole entire surface over and over again through the use of line, through figure style. Some of the figures are completely disconnected from the base, from the background. They're so far removed. They are layered upon each other. There's arguably 4 layers of people. And so if you look at the bottom, the figures are even physically smaller than those at the top. All of them, including the Romans, etc. So what we see here is this rejection of classical art, this rejection of these classical Greek elements that we've been looking at, with these very defined mathematical proportions where things are balanced. We're considering the high classical period of Greece in terms of bodily proportions, whereas here we see much more squat figures, and obviously the chaos is not reflective of the ancient Greek priority of balance. So let's look at the difference between the Romans and the Goths. We're seeing these elements that we're extremely familiar with by now. These Goths are individualized, but notice how their features are extremely exaggerated, almost like this caricature of these foreigners. Again, barbarian means foreigners, of these barbarians. They're displayed disdainfully. They have puffy cheeks and noses, these wild expressions. They're supposed to look very uncivilized with these primitive features, this rough, uneven skin. Versus when we come back to our main figure who's centrally placed, he's the hero of it all. The clear focal point amongst this tangled mess surrounding him. He's His arm is splayed out. He's open-chested. He looks strong. He's in this fancy, heavily draped armor. He has no weapon, no helmet. He's the only one without it, which indicates he's likely more of a general. So he's higher above them, helping command his troops. Also, there's an argument to be made that he's not wearing a helmet because he sees himself as invincible. He doesn't need that helmet. But everything is moving. We describe this as chaotic, and we have these twisting positions, these riding positions. No one is standing still. No one is stagnant. So movement is key to understanding this piece. This period is often called the late antique. And part of that is to illustrate how it's definitely a rejection of the classical style that we saw before, that it looks extremely different than almost the entirety of the rest of our Roman period. So we'll come back to the idea of late antique with our early Christian art unit. Okay, and then follows that is this attempt at a new form of ruling this empire, which is faltering. And this is Diocletian and the Tetrarchy. So the Tetrarchy, tetra means four, arch means rule. This is from 284 to 305. So Diocletian becomes emperor, and his idea is that we're going to split the empire, and we're going to rule under these four individuals. But primarily it's more of this concept of you have these two Caesars, two Augusti, and then underneath them are the Caesars. And so when the Augusti, such as Diocletian and his counterpart Maximian, would die, then the Caesars would take over. Galerius would take over Diocletian's area, Constantius Chlorus would take over Maximian's era, and you would choose two new Caesars. So it's supposed to help keep things stable. This line of succession is clear. However, let's just consider the artwork and how this obviously doesn't work out. He's trying to stabilize the empire. The currency had, been debased. There are many issues. Obviously, it's been very bloody. People have been vying for power. And he does do some good here. There is a little bit of stability. He reorganized much of the administrative centers, the provincial divisions, bureaucratic government structure, etc. But anyway, let's focus on how this artwork really reveals the changes that have been occurring here. So this would have been the part of the base of the column. It was removed. This is not its original location. It was actually taken later and brought to Milan, Venice. But anyway, I'll give you a moment to just observe and see what your initial impressions of this artwork are. Like, what messages are you receiving from it? And so you likely aren't describing this as powerful figures, that they are not trying to send a clear message of their power and their military might. In fact, these arms wrapped around make them look almost fearful, right? Like they're cowering together, that they're one's trying to protect the other, gripping the other in fear. So, again, they're holding onto their swords. They look scared. They don't look powerful. The argument, though, is that this was supposed to show that they're leaning on one another, that they're working together as a unit, that they're ready to defend the nation, so their hands are on their swords. They're ready to defend this empire, but they're going to do so together. We don't even have a lot of individualization here. Our Augusti have some beards. The Caesars are younger, so they lack a beard. But otherwise, these figures look extremely similar. So it's interesting with the fall of Rome is reflected in much of the art here, even if it's not intentionally done. And let's talk about, again, this rejection of this classical form. These figures are much more squat than the other or previous periods, where their proportions are much shorter, their figure style, their mannerisms, their posture, their positions, etc. look extremely different. And this is supposed to be more about the conceptual. So it's like they disregard naturalism in order to focus solely on the message. And in this case, it was supposed to communicate stability through leaning on each other in a supportive way. But now the figures are much more simplified, again, because it is about the message. So they're rejecting this focus on naturalistic figure style. Now the medium is porphyry, and this purple becomes directly associated with kings later on. When we come back to this area of the world later on with our early Christian units, etc., we'll see that purple is associated with that. The color purple had been associated with like senators, etc. before. But anyway, so that's a foretelling of what's to come. And it is an extremely expensive material. So this purple hard stone. So archaizing, we see that on here. It's this it's rejecting the Greco-Roman style, in other words. And this really reflects, archaizing is this ending of the ancient world, essentially. So, here we have the next coming up. Constantine is actually the son of Constantius Chlorus. Maxentius is the son of Maximian, sorry. And they come up. Okay, here's the comparison of classical to classicism, rejection of that, more about the message and concept. So it's conceptual. And so here we have the next group, and this doesn't work out. So let's talk about Constantine. He reigned from 312 to 337. Here are some images of him. We see some familiar aspects, this emphasis on the eyes. Think back to like our high empire with Marcus Aurelius. But in general, our figure styles are different, except for this cool bronze here. So one of the reasons why so many of his images his images have lasted is because of his association with Christianity. Once he became emperor, sole emperor, he moves the capital to Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. He named it after himself, which again marks this major decline in the Roman Empire. We're even moving it away from Rome. So let's use the head of Constantine and what would have been this part of this colossal statue to describe the story of Constantine. And so this was erected to commemorate his victory over Maxentius at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312. And so we have this battle between Maxentius, and in the last battle, when Constantine and Maxentius are battling at the entrance of Rome, prior to this, he had this vision of a cross, of this Chi-Rho symbol, which you can see on the right, which represents Jesus Christ. It was before the modern-day cross appears. This is the original symbol, the Chi-Rho symbol. Christianity has already been around for a few hundred years, but it's more on the outskirts. It's not a major religion. They had been persecuted, not to the extent that modern movies or legends discuss, but they weren't in a major religion. Anyway, so Constantine has this vision of this cross, and he receives this message that if he wears the sign of this Chi-Rho, then he will be victorious in battle. And so he ends up painting this symbol, this Chi-Rho symbol, on the shields of all of his troops, and he attaches it to his banners. And so he uses this symbol, and he does defeat Maxentius. So this changes his life. He becomes the sole emperor in 312 by winning this battle. And the following year, he creates the Edict of Milan, which this is it's an edict that allows, it opens up the Christian world. It's basically about religious tolerance, that all religions will be accepted. So this ends the persecution of Christianity. Right before he dies in 337, he is baptized, so he's considered the first Christian emperor. So this colossal statue there were many colossal statues throughout the ancient world, and it would have been made of marble, and his body was made of wood. Here's an artistic reconstruction of that. You can see with that emphasis on the eyes, like I talked about, where now we better understand why Marcus Aurelius' equestrian statue lasts. However, Constantine's never shown really with a beard, so we're lucky that it lasted. Here it is, just out in the open in this courtyard at this Capitoline Museum. Again, it's colossal, so here I am standing next to his elbow. And there's the head above. So here are the pieces that remain. Again, they would have been placed across the ancient world. Like, just the head itself is about 8.5 feet tall and weighs 8 tons. So let's talk about his arch, the Arch of Constantine. And we're going to end with this one. So the Arch of Constantine was erected to commemorate this victory against Maxentius. It's located right by the Colosseum, as you can see in the picture on the right. And it's also located near our Forum. So here in the background is our Arch of Titus. Here's Palatine Hill, upon which Rome was initially founded. And so this is in a major location. And it's also along the route that these triumphs these parades, these triumphal routes in Rome's ceremonial parades would go through. So it's surrounded by these other important historical arches. Near it is also Septimus Severus's arch, who we discussed briefly earlier. So this one is different because while most Roman triumphal arches celebrated victories over foreign powers, this one celebrated a victory over a Roman rival. Okay, so again, there's this shift. The empire is extremely different. And he also they chipped away pieces of other arches. So he uses, and this is an example you'll see on the screen of a spoila, where you're reusing these materials, which we've already discussed examples of. Now we're adding another term. And so he pulls from, go to this image. He pulls images from Marcus Aurelius. He pulls images from Trajan. And he pulls images from Hadrian's triumphal arch. And so there are some arguments about why. Some our historians argue either side. I say it's probably reflective of both. That A, Rome is in decline. The Roman Empire is in decline. So part of this reuse of materials reflects how the lack of funding and training of these skilled artists. But B is he's trying to align himself with these good emperors. Remember, these are good emperors. So we've seen where previous emperors used familiar elements of those of the past in which they're trying to communicate a similar message. And so here he's pulling directly from them. However, in some of these depictions of these other emperors, contemporary artists of Constantine actually chipped away at their faces to make them look more like Constantine. So there again comes in our argument of the lack of resources to create his own images, and so he's utilizing others. Either way, we have this major difference, and we're seeing the fall of Rome. Let's start at the top. So we have this dedication inscription to Constantine, and we have images pulled from Marcus Aurelius, which are extremely classical. We see our Dacian captives, which we reference with our Forum of Trajan. So this is directly from there. I mean, they're massive. I want to say they're over 10 feet tall, I think. And then we have these roundels over on the right, these roundels which were pulled from Hadrian's arch. And then we have frieze and some plinths beneath the columns, bases that are for Constantine. They were made contemporary to him. So we're going to hone in on just two of these images. And on the left, we have the Arch of Constantine, which is showing the sacrifice to Apollo. And on the right, we have the distribution of largesse by Constantine. And so this is where the largesse is, he's essentially giving coins to the Roman people. He's taking care of the Roman people. That's what that refers to. His head is missing, but we see him seated. We're familiar with this idea of power on a throne. But compare the figure style, compare the space, etc., where our classical depiction done by Hadrian, we see our contrapposto pose, we see our organized composition. These are extremely classical elements versus this complete rejection of those classical elements under Constantine, where we see those squat images that marks the late archaic, which will last for centuries, and where the focus is more on the idea that he's giving money to the people, that he's taking care of them. So they're rejecting these focus on naturalism and instead focusing on the message or the concept. And there we have the end of the Roman Empire.